Okay, so we're going to get started today with exercise 120. But before we get into that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about line weights in more depth. Our purpose today is to work on the building's elevations. You guys have been working on the floor plans for the last couple days. We're going to work on the elevations today. As part of your assignment 105, as part of your assignment 105, you are going to draw all four of the building's elevations. We're starting today with the south elevation, but I'll work you through and show you how to do each of those elevations. But I think talking about line weights and explaining why line weights are so important is really kind of a critical segue into the whole thing. So the stuff that I'm showing today applies to floor plans, it applies to sections, and of course it applies to elevations. I'm going to emphasize elevations because that's what we're drawing, but really what I'm talking about here could extend to any of the architectural drawings, or any drawings for that matter. The weight of a line simply refers to the relative thickness or sometimes darkness of a line. And so the thicker and darker it is, the stronger that line becomes and the more it stands out on the page. It's a basic graphic property to your drawing. If you want to get better at drawing, you get better at line weights. And so the more intuitive that becomes, the easier it is to draw really well. It also controls how we see space. So the more familiar you are with line weights and the more you start to view drawings with line weights, the more you can tell what's happening based on what's darker and what's lighter. And so it's a way of communicating that information to somebody else. There's also line types: dashed line, hidden line, center line, phantom line. The line types also are a code for something, and we'll talk about what those are. So there's line weight and there's line type. This is a lot of text to kind of take in, but some of the highlights here are basically we have solid lines, ones that are solid, no surprise. We have dashed lines that represent generally hidden object or something that's underneath something else. We have movement lines for things that move, something that is in one place, then it moves to another, a door swing, that sort of thing. We have annotation or leader lines. We're not covering annotations at all in this class because it's something that takes a little bit too long. We don't have enough time for that. But your AutoCAD class or any one of the other classes will go through that. Break lines, those are those lines with the little like heartbeat in them that say we're stopping in one place and we're continuing on and we're cutting out what's in the middle. Center lines define the center of a circle. Section lines are things that have been cut through. And dimension lines are kind of like leader and annotation lines. They give a little bit more information. So I think this, again, a lot of text, and I apologize, we'll get to the images in a little bit. But I think this is a really good slide because it talks a lot about how these line weights apply in various formats. So if we start, I'm going to actually jump down toward the bottom here, and I'm going to start at the bold lines section. And so the bold line section, these are the outermost boundaries of objects. These are kind of big lines that are going to appear on your drawing, the heavy lines that are going to appear. And it's telling us here that this is the lead that you'd be using if you were drawing it by hand. Not that anybody draws by hand anymore, but if you were in 130, for example, that would be the lead that you'd probably be using to create that line. Then it translates into AutoCAD, 0.3 to 0.4 millimeters. That's an AutoCAD line weight. And then it also translates into what the Illustrator line weight would be, 0.7 to 1 point in weight. So it's kind of giving us all three of those options. So let's go and start back up at the top here for a second. Construction lines. These are the lightest lines. These are the ones that go away long term. They're used as we're doing our construction. Sometimes they stay in the background. They're less important information. They're the lighter information. And they're supposed to be delicate. In the old days, this had to do with you could erase them later, or if this is going way old school, if you were doing blueprints or blue lines of your drawings, line weights used to matter a lot because the better your lines were. You did them on vellum, which is kind of a see-through paper, and you took that piece of paper and you stacked it together with a paper that had an ammonia-based coating on it. You stacked those two pieces of paper and you fed them into this super toxic machine that really stunk. And as you fed it into that machine, light would pass through the paper onto the special ammonia-based paper underneath it, and where your lines were would stay dark, and where there were no lines, the light would go through and that would become light and it would be exposed through this machine, and you get those old school either blue lines or blueprints, depending on the method. So your line weights really mattered at that point because it had to do with your drawings. If you were up here in the construction lines at 6H or 4H lines and they were really light, you could feed it through that machine and they would never show up. So there was actually reason for doing it that light because you could draw and not have it show up in the final drawing. Now we'd end up erasing it or lightening it up a little bit. So they're there. That's old school. That's by hand. If you're doing it at 0.05 or 0.1 millimeters in AutoCAD, it's going to be very faint when you go ahead and create it. The next section here is the light lines section. And I think one of the important distinctions here is that light lines don't mean that they shouldn't be seen. They're visible objects. They should be seen. They're just really thin. So they're still meant to be visible. They're just really thin. Then we move into the medium lines. These are things like furniture, doors, windows, etc. They're going to be in medium weight. Bold lines are the outermost boundaries of objects, silhouette lines, etc. And finally, we get down to the cut lines. This is a section cut or a floor plan. This would be the walls in a floor plan at 0.4 or above. So here's a little bit of a visual. So in this particular slide, we are this little eyeball looking through this plane at this object and drawing this plan of it. Does that make sense for what we're seeing? So if I look at this, and we're looking straight down at that object, we have two dark lines along either side, there and there. I'm not going right on top of it so you can see it. We have two dark lines, and we have a surface line that's close to us for this cut that's represented by that little thinner line. If we move over to the next section here, number 2, this slopes down and away from us. So as we look at it, the darkest line is here, here, and here. The next line would be there, and that line there. And our lightest line is down at the bottom. So as we look at that drawing right here, we can see what's closer to us because it's darker and what's further away because it's lighter. So just by the line weights, we could tell that there's depth there. Do you guys see that? Next one over here. This one is where we're looking straight down. There is no slope. So we have one line weight that represents the upper piece and another set of lines that represents the lower piece. So we're seeing what's closer and what's further, and that's it. The last one here is also a good one because in this scenario, this tucks underneath our edge. So we see that same nice bold line here, here, and here. We see our light lines here and here, but then they've added this hidden line right there to represent that edge that's underneath. So we're using a different line type to denote that it's underneath. We're using the hidden line. And we'll use a little bit of hidden lines in our work today. Another example or a set of lines here, we've got our section lines. These are demarcation lines, our dimension lines, our break lines, phantom lines, center lines, dashed lines. You guys get the idea. Most of this is annotation-based line weights. So here's the same shape, the same set of lines over and over again. And if you squint at this, the shapes look totally different because of what is darker. That's what stands out. That's what comes forward. And so even though this is the same grouping of lines each time, we see different objects out of it. Do you guys see how that happens? And so that's all done just by your line weights. So let's start to look at some elevations. And I'm going to start with some hand-drawn elevations so you can see kind of the old school method of why line weights mattered. And then we'll move into some of the computer renderings. So as we look at this elevation, this is a very sketchy elevation. It's not super precise, though I bet it was to scale. A couple things stand out. If you squint at it, what's the darkest line? The ground line, the cut line. So this line here is the darkest line. That tells us where are we cutting the ground to look at this elevation and what's happening with that ground. So whenever it's a cut line, it's always the darkest line. As you squint at it, what would be the next darkest line? It's a little bit trickier to see. I think it's in two places. One, it could be right there along this edge because this window pops out towards us, or it could be on the outermost edge, there's another example of it there, of the building, right there and there. So we're trying to delineate, maybe it's up top here at the very top. We're trying to delineate what is the outermost edge of this particular drawing, or what is closest to us, i.e. that little pop out that's coming out toward us. So as we're ranking it, this would be number 1, this would be number 2, maybe this would be number 3, this is also a number 3, this is a number 3 there. Then we keep going backwards. We might get more detail like the doors, this window edge, that might be number 4. These textures start to be maybe number 5. That texture is probably number 5, etc. Do you see how I'm working my way down? A good drawing tends to have at least 5 line weights. It's a good rule of thumb. More is always better, but I would say at least 5. So let's jump into the next slide. Again, another hand drawing, but a little bit more precision involved in this. Come on in. So as we look at this, we don't have that section line anymore. So we don't have that big thick line. But if we squint at it, we can start to say, okay, what stands out most to us? And this one has a lot on it. There's shadows going on, etc. But in this scenario, I think the things that stand out most to us are the things that pop forward. So if I were looking at this, I would say this piece of the building here as a whole is darker, and the line weights are a little bit thicker because it's coming toward us. Likewise, the outline around this and the outline around this are also a little bit darker because they're coming forward and toward us. So if we squint at it, and that's kind of one of those things where you can, if you start to squint at it, you can start to see what pops forward. Like the outline of the fireplace, for example, is darker than the rock itself. That's telling us where the fireplace is. So you can start to see how this evolves. I would say the thickest line is probably right there. That would be number 1 in my book. Let me wipe this and then we'll draw it again. I would say right there, around here, that's probably number 1. The roof there is probably number 2. That's also a number 2. This edge right there is probably a number 1 still. That there is probably a number 1. And we work our way back. The textures, that's probably number 4. Up here, that's further away, that's probably number 5. The trees themselves are probably more like number 6s. Even though they're in front, they're done really light so they don't distract too much from the actual elevation view. Do you guys see how these line weights are coming to play? So let's look at a computer drawing. Very different to go from the hand-drawn version to the computer drawing, but we can still pick out the line rates really clearly. Thickest line is that bottom line, the ground line. Next thickest line goes around the outside of the building, or perhaps, let me draw on this. I can't do this without drawing on. There's 1. Number 2 is either the deck that comes forward, or it's the line that goes around the outside of the building there. So those could be flip-flopped, 2 and 3. It depends on how you're seeing it. So there's 2 and 3. 4 is probably the added details of the doors. Maybe that line there, that's probably 4. Siding here is probably 5. And the siding down here is probably 6. And maybe that there is probably 6. So you see I'm kind of ranking my way through it. And like I said, typically a good drawing is going to have about 5 line weights. So we're getting to those 5 line weights each time. Next example here. Sometimes they have the shadows. The shadows help things stand out. We can really see where the overhangs are here because of the standouts of the shadows. You're not going to be required to actually draw the shadows, though if it's something that you want to do, I'll show you how to do it. Typically on an elevation, we just fake the shadows. We don't actually do the full rendering of the shadows. But if you end up modeling in 3D, let's say you take the 136 class, you'll learn how to create those shadows and be able to put them into your elevations from a technical standpoint at a specific date and time. But again, we're seeing a whole system of line weights. Generally, the line that goes all the way around the outside is thicker than the stuff that's inside, certainly thicker than the siding that's being used, etc. Another example here, cut line being thickest, and then we work our way back thinner and thinner. I like this one because it shows how you can take the actual line drawing elevation and you can do some collage work over the top of it to start to show textures, to start to show atmosphere, to start to show what it would feel like to be in this particular space. Very simple set of drawings, not too much happening here, but again, very much based on line weights. So we're seeing things based on line weights. Things that are darker are coming forward. Things that are lighter are going backward. So there starts to be a lot of repetition here, where you can see kind of the same theme going forward. This one's a little bit more technical. We're seeing a little bit more of the line types in here than just the line weights. Sometimes people put in color to start to add to it. I think color can work really nicely in some cases. Other cases, it's nice to just see the line drawing. And you guys, when we bring our elevations and our plans, I'm going to show you how to do this collage work in Illustrator afterward. You have to decide how much is the right amount versus how much is too much. So there's a fine line from an artistic standpoint of what you're trying to do. This one has a great set of line weights because we can really see that one piece of the building comes forward. If I took those line weights away, it would be much harder to see what's coming forward and what's going back in this particular set of drawings. Another example here of elevations. Okay, so this one is the project that I'm currently building in Lafayette right now. This drawing was on the cover of the design review packet. So when this is getting into kind of technical terms, when you're doing a project, depending on where you're doing the project, there are several layers of review that allow you to move forward with the project. And typically around here, their first step is going to some kind of a commission or a hearing, a public forum, where you say, this is what I'd like to do. And there's some commissioners and there's people from the public that come and speak about it. And they say, yes, we like your project, or no, we don't like your project. You should keep designing. Unfortunately, there's lots of you should keep designing. This particular project took 10 public hearings and 3 years to get approved. So it's a lot of argument. Anyway, this was designed as a drawing that shows, hey, this is kind of the general character of the building. This is what we're proposing to see right in the front of the project. So this was a design review document. Here's some color, here's some extra information. You don't see as much of the line weights here because you're being dominated by the color. But it's certainly a valid elevation of the building. This drawing, same elevation, a little bit more technical, but this is further back in the packet where we're trying to emphasize, hey, this is the type of shingle that we're putting in, this is what the corner trim is going to be, here's some elevation marks, just a little bit more technical detail. Notice, though, that there's a lot of line weights in this drawing. So we've substituted the color for all of the line weights. There's a little bit of shadow so you can see what's standing out, but it's really very much about line weights. And so I would argue that this is a line weight drawing. And I think there's probably 8 or 9 line weights in it. And anyway, this is one of the drawings that I did for this. So once you get approved through the design review and then the planning commission, then you get into construction drawings. Hey, we need to build this. What's it going to look like from a technical standpoint? And so when you get to the construction drawing phase, you end up with a drawing that's more like this. So notice that the line weights have really gone away. Same elevation. The line weights have really gone away because this drawing is no longer about showing space or showing somebody, hey, this is what I want to build. This is about, this is what I need to build, and let me give you a bunch of technical information about how I want you to build it. And so all of these little circles and marks are specific details about how I want this built, how I want that built, how I want you to deal with this, how I want the eave built, etc. We get numbers on the windows, so it goes in a door and window schedule, numbers on the doors. So you know exactly what type of door it is, exactly what type of window it is, so that you can hand this to a general contractor and have them actually build it. So it's 3 elevations, and they're for 3 distinct different purposes. And the line weights and the drawings reflect those 3 different purposes. I like to show you something like this so you can kind of understand the spectrum of what we do and why we do drawings in a certain manner. Does that help a little bit? Okay. So I love this. If you want to get good at drawing, get good at line weights. That's really what drawing is all about. And this is whether you do computer drawings or whether you do hand drawings. If you start to learn to do line weights in your sketchbook, suddenly your drawings will get that much better. So get good with line weights and you'll really be taking off. Okay, so that's it from the slides standpoint. We're going to sit down. We're going to move right into exercise 120 as soon as I switch over. And I'll show you how to draw these building elevations. Give me a second. OK, so on we go with our exercise 120. We're going to work with the same file that we worked with last class. So I've gone ahead and I've opened my file here. And it's exactly the same as the last class. I'm going to zoom in on it right there so we can see it. And now we need to go through and we need to actually draw the elevations of this building. And so this is going to be a big challenge for a lot of you because you've spent the time figuring out what the floor plan looks like and what the orientation of the rooms looks like. And now it's time to figure out what does the space feel like? How tall are the ceilings? And what does it look like from the outside? And so we're going to start with the south elevation, which is the elevation directly below this drawing. And so typically when somebody's working on these elevations, and you probably did this in 130, we start to fold out our elevations. We start to work with one drawing and bring down lines and guides and draw the related drawing next to it. So I'm going to draw the elevation of this right down here below my floor plan. So I take my floor plan and I'm going to draw the elevation right below it. So before I start drawing the elevation, I'm going to create a couple new layers. So I'm going to go ahead and click on my Layer Properties button, or I'm going to type Layer to bring up the Layer Properties Manager. Here it is. And I'm going to go ahead and create a couple new layers. The first layer, when I click on New Layer here, I'm going to call this layer South Elevation. I could also do A-South Elevation if I wanted to. But again, we're not in a specific firm, so nobody's looking at this drawing, so I can name it what I want. And I'm going to go ahead, and with the south elevation, I'm going to leave the line weights just at the default for right now. We'll come back and deal with the line weights a little bit later on. Line weights in elevations tend to be less layer-based and more just custom. You assign the line weights as we go. So I have the south elevation layer, but I'm also going to create one more layer right here, and I'm going to call this layer Guides. And this Guides layer, before I move on here, I'm going to come over to the non-printing, or the little printer icon, and I'm going to click on it, and it'll get a little red slash next to it, so it is a non-printing layer. And the purpose here is that what I draw on my Guides layer, I don't want to end up printing. So I'll have it on my non-printing layer. I will also change the color of the Guides layer. For me personally, I tend to make it green. I have no idea why, but it's habit, so I end up making it green. So that represents a non-printing layer for me, and I'm ready to start working. Now, I'll go ahead and move my Guides layer to be the current layer, so I'll double click so it gets the green check mark, and I'll start drawing here. So when I start to pull down corners, and that's what I'm going to start with, are corners, I could start with the line tool, I could snap to the corner, and I could draw down. This, however, gives me a fixed length. I have to pick where the endpoint would be. Instead, I can also use something called a ray. And this is, again, kind of the sort of thing that you have to decide what feels right to you. The ray tool is right here in your home ribbon, or you could type ray. And what this is it asks for a start point and then a direction. And no matter how far I zoom back, that line just keeps going off into infinity. The other related tool is called a construction line, or an X line. It's right next to the ray tool, and the difference here is that it just goes in both directions instead of one direction. So same tool, it's just one direction versus both directions. So I'm going to stick with the ray tool for right now, and I'm going to make a line from each corner of my building. So go there. By the way, I'm right-clicking to repeat the last command. And I'm giving myself one ray for each corner of my building. You may only have two corners. In my building, I have this little jog in the center, so I have more than one. Next thing I need to determine where the ground is going to be. This is an arbitrary line. It doesn't matter how far away it is. I'll do that with the construction line. So I'll come over here to the X line, or the construction line. I'll specify a point down here. I'll make sure it's horizontal. And now that line's going in both directions, like that. So I have, theoretically, the ground. And I have the corners of my building. Now it's time to start drawing what's happening. So I'm going to go ahead and change my layer. And I'm going to go to the south elevation layer. I'm going to go ahead and start with the line tool. And I'm going to start drawing my walls. So for right now, I'm going to go ahead and draw, and this is where you have to start thinking about what's your ceiling height going to be, how tall is this building going to be. Given that this is a cabin, I'm going to make the ceiling heights a little bit taller. So we'll say maybe 10 feet. Instead of 8 feet. Typical ceiling would be 8 feet. I'll come across here, and I'll come down like that. That gives me two corners of my building, there and there. I'll come back to my line tool. We'll go across in the middle. I may need to turn on my perpendicular snap. There it is. I'll come down. And one more set of lines. I'll come over, and I'll come down. So I've just delineated where the walls would be. And this line, and this line, and this line are all forward, correct? So those lines should theoretically be a little bit thicker. So I can select those and come up to my properties here, and I can change the thickness. And I'm going to change them to 0.3. And that's going to help you see that those are standing out just a little bit more in this drawing. So I'm changing the line weights as I go, as opposed to changing them based on layer. So at this point, I have to start thinking about a couple things. One, this green line here is what my actual floor is of the building. It's not where the ground is, because the ground's a little bit lower than where the floor is in a building. So typically, there's about a foot below for structure, and then there's probably another 8 inches to a foot below that of concrete foundation. And it's hard because you guys aren't in a place where you're getting a super technical education about this kind of stuff yet. So I'm going to try to give you some ballpark estimates. But trust me, for right now, we need a little bit more to each of these for structure. So I could take each of these lines, and I could actually extend them down by another foot. So as I'm moving it, I could type in 1 foot, and it makes it longer by a foot. So I select it, click on the blue dot, start to drag it down 1 foot. Notice that I have two pieces where I can insert information. One is the distance from where I started. The other is the overall distance. I can flip between those two inputs by pressing the Tab key. I should have been able to do that. Doesn't want me to do it. That's the angle. That's the angle. There it is. And so I could say what it is overall. In this case, it would be 11 feet. To me, it's a lot easier to just say how much you want to move. So we'll continue moving it by 1 foot, like that. So I've extended each of those lines down below where the floor would be. We'll go ahead and draw a line that goes across. So we'll go there. I'm going to repeat my line there, repeat my line, and we'll draw it there. Again, this piece and this piece both come forward, so I'd go ahead and make those a little bit thicker. We'll do that as at 0.3, and we'll leave these ones back at the default. So the last thing is giving myself a little bit of ground down here, so I'll go down another 8 inches to a foot, something like that. And I'll use my smart tracking to do that. I'll come down here by 1 foot. And I'll come across. Typically, the ground is a little bit longer than your building. So I'll make that a little bit longer. And I'll go ahead and take the ground, and I'll make it even thicker. So we'll come down here at maybe 0.7. Remember, that's the thickest line in your drawing, because that's what's being cut through. Now, the astute student would be saying, wait a minute, isn't there slope on the ground? You're absolutely right. We'll get to the slope. The slope in these elevations is completely optional. If you feel like you want to try to calculate out what the slope is, I'll show you how to do it, but it's not something that you have to do. Yeah, bro? For the sides of the ground? You mean like how far down this is? Well, this, I think the safest thing is to think of it as a foot and then a foot. That's safe numbers. This line, you mean? The horizontal green lines are rays, so they're infinite. They just go off into space. I just snapped to the corner and I made it just go off into infinity. So there's nothing specific there. And I didn't set my building at any specific distance from my floor plan. Okay? So notice that I started with kind of the bottom of the building, and I haven't dealt with the roof just yet. Well, because the roof is a little bit trickier because you have to think about what the roof looks like. The simplest roof is kind of a modernist flat roof, though you should all know from a technical standpoint, roofs are never really flat. They always have a little bit of slope to them. But we call them flat roofs, and we tend to draw them as flat roofs. So the simplest solution here is, OK, I want a flat roof. I'll go ahead and draw a flat roof across this particular building. The other thing that I have to think about is any part of this building taller than another part? So for example, do I want, say, the bedroom wing here to be a little bit taller than what's happening in the center, and this part of the building to be a little bit taller? Maybe I do. Or maybe I want this middle section to be a little bit shorter. So I can type move, and I can drop that by 2 feet, for example. It's a style thing. It's a design decision. And so I'm not saying you have to do it. It's just something to be aware of as you start to think through it. So if it was a flat roof, typically I'd have a little bit of an overhang out to either side, and I would draw a thickness of, let's say, about a foot. That's a reasonable. So let me go ahead and draw this, and I'd come maybe an overhang of a foot. I'd come up by a foot. I'd go back over here. I'm going to snap to there, select it, and then move it by a foot. And I would come down here, maybe like that. I could do the same thing here. I could say that's a foot. And there's that. This one doesn't have overhangs because it's in between those two. And likewise, I could draw this. This would be over 1 foot, up by 1 foot. I'll extend it by 1 foot there. And I could draw it like that. This set of lines and this set of lines, oops, there, are toward the front. So again, they would be increased in their thickness like that to show that they're standing forward. So for some people, flat roof is perfectly reasonable solution. Some people don't want the look of a flat roof in a cabin. That's OK too, in which case we need to think about this with a slope to it. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those flat roofs, and I'll show you how I go about calculating out the slope. So in this scenario, if I start from this point here, I need two things. One, I need to know either what the angle is or what the rise over run would be. And so you've probably heard in the past, roofs are designated by like a 6 and 12 or an 8 and 12. And what that means is for every 12 inches of run, you're going up by whatever the smaller number is. So if it's an 8 and 12, for every 12 inches of run, you're going up 8 inches. Right? Or for every 12 inches of run, you're going down 8 inches. It's the same. It doesn't matter which direction. So typical roof around here is somewhere between a 4 and 12 and a 6 and 12 if you have a pitched roof. That's normal for around here. Up in the Sierras, you're going to get something that's a little bit taller because you want the snow to be able to shed off. So it's typically more 8 and 12 to all the way up to a 12 and 12. An A-frame, like a cabin with a really steep roof, might be up to an 18 and 12. So it's really steep for every 12 inches. So in my scenario here, I'm going to do it I don't know, let's do it at a, I don't want it to be a 12 and 12 because that's a perfect 45. You might want it that way, but I want to show you how to do it not as a perfect 45 degree. So let's do it as, I don't know, let's do it as an 8 and 12. So in this scenario, it's a perfect opportunity to use our relative coordinates. Remember, we did this in the very beginning. This is where I type the @ sign first, and then I specify some points. So in this scenario, I would say I want 12 feet of run, comma, what's my rise in that 12 feet? Well, it would be 8 feet. So typically I speak of inches. You know, an 8 and 12 would be 12 inches of run for 8 inches of rise. I just made them feet, so I made it a little bit longer. Then I'll go ahead and press enter, and that gives me the slope. It's way too long, but that's OK. Let me come back to my line. I'll start at this point here. And in this scenario, I would do the same thing. This would be negative 12 feet, comma, 8 feet. And I get that part of the slope. And these are obviously long. So this is a point where I could do a trim. So I'll come up here to trim. I'll select those two. I'll press enter. And I can remove those two pieces right there. So I would need to do the same thing over here with this roof. So I'll go back to my line. I'll snap here. And so in this scenario, same thing. At 12 feet, comma, 8 feet. Oops, 8 feet, not 87 feet. There it is. One more time, snapping from there. This would be at negative 12 feet, comma, 8 feet. And so I end up with this. I'll go ahead and trim these off again. I'll select trim, select those two objects, enter, and we'll go ahead and trim there and there. And I'll press enter. So that gives me those two slopes. Sometimes there's a little bit of an overhang on one of these. If you want to show a little bit of an overhang, typically you have to decide how much overhang there's going to be. So let's say it's over by a foot, maybe. I might come over by 1 foot. Just draw a little guide for myself. And then I can extend this line out to meet that. I'll use the extend tool, which is available underneath the trim. There's extend, this line, and this line. I'll hit enter. And I want that line to go out by a foot. That's the easiest way of doing it. The other solution would be to do it with a fillet, like I did before, with a radius. So I type R for radius of 0. And then I could connect this and that at a point. So I'm starting to create this. Next thing, there's typically some thickness to the roof. It's not just a line. So I'm going to use the offset tool. And here, let's do it at about, we'll go 8 inches. And we'll offset it that way. Technically, that would be based on a particular size of lumber. So it wouldn't be a round number. It would be a 2 by 10, which would be 9 1/4. Or 2 by 12, which would be 11 1/4. But for our purposes, we don't need to worry about that too much. So I'll go ahead and finish out the rest of this. I can use that fillet tool again, or I could use the extend tool. I'm going to use the fillet because it makes life easy. So there's a fillet. My R for radius would be 0. I can connect this to this. I can connect this to that. I need the overhang over here. Let me go ahead and take this piece, and I'll mirror from the center over there. And then I can fill it one more time. Like that. You guys see how I start to work through what that looks like? The other thing that you can decide to do is if you don't want your the ends of your rafters cut plumb, you could have them slope back in like that. Oops. It's just a style decision, and you could cut that part off. Flexibility. OK, so I have that one drawn. I'm going to repeat the whole process over here. Repetition is a good thing. We'll come over by a foot. And I'll go ahead and use the fillet tool again. My radius is still 0, so I can go ahead and connect this to that. I can also offset by 8 inches, there, and there. And we can fill it one more time, there and there. Repeat the fillet for that. I'll take this piece and mirror it over. And oops, one more fillet. And there, and there. So all that looks reasonable. I have not dealt with this piece in the center just yet. And the reason I haven't dealt with that piece in the center is I don't know where the ridge of that is. And I don't know it because I haven't drawn it just yet. So sometimes you actually can't finish the whole elevation until you start drawing one of the other elevations. So at this point, let me go ahead and adjust my line weights just a little bit. So there and there, those would all go up. I'll come over to my line weights. Those were at 0.3. And there, we're seeing that part of the elevation. So I'm going to skip this roof for right now. I'll come back to it. But it's time to go ahead and start drawing some of the windows. So with nothing selected, I'm going to switch my layer back to the guides layer. And at this point, I'm going to use the ray tool again. And I'm going to designate where one of these windows falls. Now I have a whole row of windows, so I can draw one and then copy them. So that makes it a little bit easier. Over here, I probably need another set of rays. Just designate where these windows would go. OK, so I've got a set of rays there. I've got a set of rays there. Oh, I have one more ray here. For the windows, this would be in the center. Like that. So we'll start over here, where I need to draw that first window. I have to think about how far off the floor. Remember, that green line was my floor. How far off the floor the window needs to be. This one was near the kitchen. Cabinet's height, or the counter height, is about 3 feet, so I might do 3'6". So I'll go up 3'6". Oops. 3 feet 6 inches. There we go. That was not what I wanted to do. Let's try that one. Oh, I need to switch my layer over to the south elevation. Let's try that one more time. Let's go up 3'6". There you go. There's the start of my window. I have to think about how tall I want that window to be. I'm going to go to 7 feet, so it's a little bit taller because of this end wall. It's a tall, skinny window. That's the outline of the window. Remember, that should be thinner than the outline of the building, but it's still thick because it's on the piece that's coming forward. So I'll take that and I'll say maybe that's at 0.25. And I'm not going to see that thickness, but I know it's there. Now I could also add some other detail to this window. So let me join that window together. So it's one window here. Then I'll offset this by maybe 1 inch to give it a little bit of a window frame. And that window frame, I'm going to change to have a 0.00 thickness on it. So I have a thick line going around the outside, then I have a thinner line for the inside. You might also decide that there needs to be trim around this window, so I could offset again. This time we'll do a 3.5, and we can do a trim around the outside of the window. I'm going to leave the trim off for right now, though, because I have multiple of these windows to copy. So that's my window. Oops. Right there. I'll select it. I'll come up here to my floor plan, and from here, I'm going to copy it. And I'll copy it from that point, and I'll make one for each of those windows. So even though I couldn't see my windows, I was just copying and pasting them from up here because I have all my windows laid out. And so there's my set of windows. Over here, it's a little bit different. This has a whole series of windows. It's kind of a wall of glass, so it takes a little bit more work to establish that one and create it. So let's go ahead and I'll start with the first line. It would be right here. And we'll do that at maybe 9 feet. Come across, back down, and right there. I'll take that window, I'm going to join it. Same thing, I'll offset it. We'll do an offset of maybe 1 inch. And that creates the frame. This window, I want to have it divided. So let me turn on my midpoint snap. There it is. And so I'll come across in the center. And I need to offset this by a 1/2 inch. So we'll do that and that. I'll get rid of the middle, so I'll press the delete key. And see how I'm starting to create what that window looks like. I'll go ahead and take that whole window. Same thing, and I'll copy it. Because I have a whole wall of them. Like that. And suddenly I've drawn in all of those windows. Now maybe ultimately I want there to be a raked window up at the top. I don't know yet, but I could end up drawing that. Part of the challenge with this sort of thing is I could sit here and draw all day because it's fun to go through and start to do this. I don't want you to have to watch me draw all day, so I'm giving you kind of general tips on things. Same thing, there would be a set of windows here. I need to draw those out as well. So you see I'm starting to create this. If I were to turn off the guides layer here, you could see that building elevation starting to come together. Let me turn that back on, like that. So, like I said, I don't know where this part of the roof is just yet. So because I don't know where that part of the roof is, I'm going to move on and start drawing the next elevation. So, all of these drawings are related to one another. All the elevations are related to one another. So if I set myself up with a few extra guides, I can use drawings in relation to one another. So let me switch over to the guides layer again. And this time I'm going to draw a bounding box around the entire outside of my shape here. So I'll start at this corner, which is my lowest corner, and I'll come up here. I don't want to snap to this corner because I need to include everything in my building. So I'm going to snap to a reference point between those two right there. So what I mean by a bounding box is a rectangle that goes all the way around and completely contains everything inside. This is the plane at which I'm taking the elevation. So it's right up next to the building, but it includes the entire building. So with that, I will go in and I will use my ray tool again. Let me come down here and I'm going to draw a ray. And this time I'm going to start at the corner of the bounding box right there. And when I go to draw, instead of specifying a distance here, I'm going to press the tab key to switch to the angle. And I'm going to type in here -45. And I'll press enter. Sorry, how about 45? No, it should be -45. There it is. And without doing anything else, I'll go ahead and press the enter key. Oh, come on. You love it when stuff doesn't work for you, right? -45, I'll press tab, and then I'm just going to click. So let me get rid of this. So this line here is at 45 degrees, or it's supposed to be. The other option would be to start, if you're having trouble with the inputs here, draw a horizontal line, a horizontal ray. Take that horizontal ray and use the rotate tool. There's your base to rotate, and say -45, and it's going to go down at a 45-degree angle. So I've created that one. I want to create more, another set, so I'll go back to ray. I'll start at this corner of the bounding box, and this time I'm going up at 45. So I press tab, and then I click without moving the mouse, and that creates that one. I'll come back again with a ray at this corner here. And in this scenario, it is 135. I'll press tab, and I'll click. And there's my next one. Last one here is a ray. And it's going to be, I think it's at 235. That doesn't quite look right. So in this scenario, I'm going to go ahead and draw it straight out, and then I will rotate it by 45 so that it's going down. So there they all are. And what this does is it gives me a reference that I can bend lines around as I start to create it. So I'm going to draw the, we just did the south elevation. I'm going to do the east elevation next. And when I do the east elevation, depending on how you work, you could just draw it right here. It's on its side. And I've actually learned, because I do this old school and I learned so long ago, I can draw an elevation on its side. I can draw the elevation upside down. It doesn't make any difference to me. However, a lot of you struggle with seeing it. So there is a trick built into AutoCAD. If I come over here to the little compass, there are these arrows up by where you close the drawing. And if you click on one of those arrows, it will actually, sorry, wrong direction. It will rotate the view for you. So you can now look at it and pull your line straight down again. So it makes life a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and continue with my rays and my construction lines to give myself the corners of the building. Let me type ray, and it would be there. Same thing, ray, and it would be right there. Now, the floor of my building comes down here, and where it intersects that 45-degree line, I'm going to create another line going across this way. I could do it with a ray, or I could do it with a construction line, like that. And so what this is allowing me to do is it's allowing me to pull information from this drawing across the 45 and bring it over. So we'll go ahead and do a ray for the ground. Where that meets, I will repeat my ray and go that way. And so this line here is now the ground. So I could draw a line. Oh, sorry, I have to switch to the south elevation first. Oh, I should probably create a layer for east elevation. Go ahead and create a new layer. East elevation, make sure it's a printing layer. Make sure it is white. There it is. We'll make it current. And then I could go ahead and start drawing. This first one is the ground. So that's going to be nice and thick. So we'll go up here at 0.7. There it is. The next one would be right here. And this was at 10 feet, if I remember correctly. Like that. And this one doesn't have anything popping out at me. So this whole shape would be at my 0.3. Like that. Now, I have a roof, and I also have this little eave that's sticking out. So where the ridge would be, I can use my ray. And so again, I'll have to switch over to the guides layer. I can use my ray to figure out where the top of this roof is. And come down. I'm going to repeat my ray and go across. This then is the ridge. So we'll start here. Sorry, switch my layer. East elevation, there it is. And I'll go from here to there. Now remember, this had an overhang of a foot, so I need to stretch this one by 1 foot. And I need to stretch this one by 1 foot. So there's my ridge. That shouldn't be as thick because it's further away from my drawing. So in this case, that would be probably more like 0.2. I need to know where this eave is. So I'll go back to my guides layer. I'll go back to my ray. And I'll draw this and that. I'll repeat my ray and draw this and that. So these two lines here represent that eave. So I'll come with my line tool. Whoops, let me switch to my east elevation again. I will draw down. I will draw all the way over. and I'll draw back up. I need to repeat and draw down, over, and back up. Now that eave blocks the top of this building, or the top of the wall that I had drawn. So I'm going to trim off that part. So I'll type trim, and we'll get rid of that, and then we'll go ahead and delete that piece there. So now I have the top of the building. This eave sticks out toward me, so that's going to be thick. So we'll do it at maybe 0.3. And maybe that means that I'll take, well, maybe I should make that a little bit more. Let's make that 0.35 because it's sticking out toward me. This and this are sloping away from me. In an ideal world, or if you were drawing it by hand, you'd go from thick to thin. But that's a little bit unrealistic in AutoCAD. So we'll pick something in the middle. So I did this upper line at 0.2. This is at 0.35. So we'll do it at maybe 0.25. Oops, sorry, wrong. Those are at 0.25. Let me take this front, and that's going to be at 0.35, like that. So I've now drawn this side elevation. I still haven't solved where this is going to fall just yet. The problem is that that little piece in the middle doesn't actually show up in any elevation. So I have to just draw it to figure out where it belongs. So I'm going to continue drawing it. I could draw it as a hidden line on this side if I wanted to. But let me go ahead with the guides layer. I'll use the ray tool. And there's one wall. And there's another wall. So there are those two pieces. I said that this was an 8-foot. So I'll go ahead and type 8 feet. And I'm leaving all of this on the guides layer because I don't want it to end up printing. I'm just using it as a reference. So there was my ceiling height for that middle section. I need to go ahead and draw my roof pitch again. So same strategy that we did before. I'll start with my line. I'll start at that corner. I'll say at 12 feet, comma 8 feet. 12 feet, comma 8 feet. Oh yeah, so I should point that out. We're drawing on its side, so my coordinates have changed. Because if we look at my x and y, they're opposite. So in that scenario, I have to be a little bit more precise about how I'm creating this. So this would be at negative 8 feet in the x, comma 12 feet in the y. There you go. There it is going up correctly. I can reference my coordinates right here, so I know which direction is which. So there's one. Let me mirror this across the center here. There's two. I'll go ahead and fill it so that this and that come together. This tells me where the ridge is, because I've drawn it here. And now I can come over and draw it over here. So I'll use my ray to transfer that measurement over and over. And so this line here is that ridge. So I can go ahead and draw the line from there to there. But that line should be in the south elevation. So there it is in the south elevation. That's further away, so its line weight should probably be 0.2. This one's a little bit closer, so let's make that one at 0.25. And likewise, let's make this one at 0.25 as well. Like that. So I figured out where that would be. I still need to draw the eave at this end. So same thing, I can continue with this and go over by 1 foot and down, fill it, offset, 8 inches, fill it, there, there, ray, from here, there and there. Those come over and meet, there, and there. The other thing that I should point out is you can see that they're starting to get a lot of guidelines. If at a certain point you feel like there's just too many guidelines and you can't tell what things are, just go ahead and take a bunch of them and delete them. They're not precious. You can create them again if you need them. I don't need the corners of the building anymore because I already established what the corners of the buildings were. OK, so there's those two. Let me go ahead and trace over them. I'll switch to the south elevation first. There. There. And there. I'll get rid of this line. And this both get the 0.25 line weight. So now I have those. Let me turn off my guides layer for a second. And so you can start to see how I'm creating these. This is not the most exciting elevation, but there's not a whole lot going on this side of the building anyway. This elevation obviously has a little more detail. I haven't drawn the connection or the foundation between the building and the ground yet on either. So let me switch back to my south elevation here. And let me draw those in. I'm going to go back to my line tool. I'm on the south elevation layer. And we can draw this straight down. Typically, there's a little bit of an offset between the foundation and the exterior of the building because of the siding. That's a technicality. If you want to draw it straight down, I'm totally OK with that. But in reality, there's usually a bit of an offset, at least a ½ inch. So for me personally, I'm going to draw it over just a little bit. Probably closer to an inch by the time you add shear. And there it is. That just grounds the building a little bit more. Same thing on this one. We make that connection. And we make that connection there as well. OK, so I have that established. I have this one established. I would keep going, and I would draw the remaining elevations. What I would do is I would start to work toward more and more detail. So get all four of the buildings laid out, then start to add the windows. Once you have all the windows, then maybe it's time to add the siding. Remember, we can use the hatch tool for the siding. So I could go back to my hatch tool here. If I wanted some vertical siding, I could go in, change the pattern. You do this one. We change the angle at 45. My scale here. I'm trying to think here. It's probably about 20. And there we go. I can add that siding in. Typically, the siding probably needs to be, go back to home. In terms of the siding properties, the thickness should be 0.00. And I really like changing the color of things like siding to be one of the grays. So I would switch over here to 251 or 252, something like that, so that it's a little bit darker. And it'll fade away a little bit more. So you can start to add in the building siding. So when it's time to add shadows, that's just an offset of this line at a particular distance. And so you could calculate it out at a 45 degree based on where it is, but you could also arbitrarily just put a little bit of shadow in there. Given the time, I'm not going to spend too much time showing you that. I'd rather have you spend your time getting your building elevations resolved. OK? So we drew the elevations. OK, the one last piece of the puzzle is the slope of the ground, if you wanted to add the slope of the ground. And I'm trying to think about whether it's better to do it right now or whether I should do it next class. I think I'm just going to do it next class when we start to do paper space and model space. For those of you interested, I'll do it at that point. So just start with your building as if it were on flat ground. We'll deal with the slope next class because I want to show you how you would go about calculating it if you want to. But I also want you to work and have a good, productive day. Are there any other questions? No? OK, good. Yeah. What, say that again. So the furniture and stuff. Since we're dealing with just the outside, typically we don't put furniture in. If it was a section cutting through the building, that's typically where you'd put it in. I guess there are a few scenarios, maybe on the deck or something, where you might want to have a chair or whatever. To me, that's a detail that comes further down the road. I would rather have more of the building elevation. Furthermore, putting a person in is probably even more valuable than putting furniture in. So in an elevation, it's not that important. And so I would say, for now, skip it. And if you feel like toward the end you really need to get it in there, then we'll work to get it in there. You can do it the same way that we put it in when we use the blocks. You just have to find elevation blocks of the furniture rather than plan view blocks of the furniture, and you can bring it in the same way. All right, I'll turn you guys loose to work. Let me know if you have questions.